Some monsters don't lurk in the shadows. Some of them walk among us, disguising themselves as the people we trust the most. Teachers, priests, social workers, friendly neighbors, and sometimes they prey on the most innocent among us. Today's story is about a man so evil, so horrifying, that he earned the nickname La Bestia, the Beast, a man who became the most prolific serial killer in modern history. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cabellos, a man who over the span of just a few years committed atrocities so gruesome that they remain burned into the history of Colombia. His victims? Helpless, vulnerable boys, tricked into trusting him, only to be subjected to torture and death at the hands of a man who showed no remorse. In this episode of Threads of Evil, we'll dive into the twisted mind of Luis Garavito, his horrific crimes, the investigation that led to his capture, and the shocking reality of his sentencing. If you thought serial killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy were horrifying, buckle up, Buttercup, because Garavito makes them look tame in comparison. He makes them look like simple fucking teddy bears. Let's go. Like many serial killers, Garavito's darkness didn't appear overnight. No, it started early, rooted in childhood filled with abuse, violence, and trauma. Born on January 25th, 1957, in Geneva, Colombia, Garavito was the oldest of 7 children. His father, Manuel Antonio Garavito, was a brutal man, an alcoholic who beat his children relentlessly and subjected them to horrific punishments. But the worst abuse was saved none other than for Garavito himself. Garavito was not only physically abused, but sexually assaulted by his father. I mean, right there, it just shows that his father is just garbage as well. His father treated him like horribly, so I mean, it's not surprising that Garavito turned out to be a monster. Now, not everyone that suffers abuse becomes monsters like, Garavito did, but I'm just saying it's not really much of a shock, if you will. Anyways, this cycle of violence became the foundation of his warped psyche. His childhood was filled with torment. He was forced to watch his mother being abused. He was neglected and growing up in absolute poverty. The anger, the humiliation, it all festered within him, waiting to be unleashed on the world. So, I mean, with all these factors, with all of this added into the whole entire situation, it's not really that much of a shock of how much of a monster he became. Like, all he saw was just suffering and torment and destruction, So, I mean, it's really not that surprising. So by the time he was a teenager, Garavito had already developed disturbing tendencies. He would torture animals, bully younger children, and express sadistic fantasies. But nobody intervened. Nobody stopped him. And so his darkness grew unchecked. And usually, as we all know, this is like the first sign, if you will, of a serial killer, of these sadistic tendencies, is usually majority of serial killers. Majority of the people that become serial killers, they torture small animals. Like, that's one of the first signs. They torture small animals. They go up to bullying. They start tormenting their peers. Most likely, they resort to sexual crimes and other various sadistic tendency and behavior. This is how it starts. So, I mean, you already see him on the path of becoming what he would become. As he grew older, Garavito drifted from job to job. He was a drifter, like his father, an alcoholic, and he had a reputation for being both charismatic and volatile. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister was brewing. So, I mean, right there in that particular instance, there's a lot of serial killers that are charismatic, and a lot of people don't realize that they were serial killers. It never dawns on these people that they were serial killers. So, like, that person was a serial killer. I mean, you got the BTK killer. You got Bundy himself was very charismatic. You've got all these infamous serial killers that were very charismatic, and nobody suspects them of being these serial killers. No one ever sees it coming. And I guess that's what makes it to where they can blend in with the rest of the society, despite their disturbing tendencies, despite their disturbing past, despite the real monsters that they really, truly, epically are. Garavito's killing spree began in the early 1990s. He had a method, a sick, twisted pattern that he followed with precision. His victims were always young boys, often from poor families, street children, orphans, street urchins, those kind of types. These were kids society had abandoned. Easy prey for a manipulative predator like Louis Garavito. He would pose as a kind stranger, sometimes as a priest, sometimes as a teacher, and even a government worker. And so they wouldn't realize that they were being tricked and deceived. They wouldn't realize that this person was not who he said he was. He would lure these boys away with promises of food, money, or a job, which, like I said, these kids were, left out by society. They had nothing going for them. And so when him luring them away with these promises of food, money, or a job, that's what they wanted. That's what they needed. And he offered it to them. And once he had them alone in a remote location, that's where the true nightmares began. So let that sit in for a moment, right? Before we continue. Garavito would torture his victims mercilessly. His crimes were not just about killing. No. They were about control. They were about inflicting as much pain as possible. He wanted them to suffer like he felt like he was suffering. He would tie them up. He would beat them. He would sexually assault them. And then, only then, when he satisfied his sadistic urges, he would kill them. And even then, it wasn't quick. Many of his victims were mutilated, their bodies left in horrifying states. Just talk about a sick individual. It gets worse, though, people. This is just the worst part. He didn't stop. He kept going. Over 140 children fell victim to the beast. And for years, he evaded capture. And it's said that it could have been 200, it could have been 300. They're not really sure how many. Just 140 are the ones that they knew about. 140 victims are the ones that they could actually trace back to him. But they said it's possible for the beast to have a lot more victims than they know of that they found. There could be more. There could be in the thousands. He is like the most infamous, notorious serial killer because of how high his victim count was. Because it was such a high victim count. It was so high of a victim count that, as far as I know, to my knowledge, and I could actually say later on in a future podcast that my knowledge previously was wrong, but to my knowledge at this point of this episode of this podcast, that is the highest victim count of any serial killer known to man. So you're probably wondering, how was he able to keep on killing? We have to remember, unfortunately, this is Colombia. For a long time, authorities failed to connect him to the murders, right? Or failed to even connect the murders because of how unconnected they seemed to be, right? They just didn't connect it. So they just thought, hey, it's street children, right? It's... No, sorry, I moved away from the microphone. Anyways, but it's like street children. It was basically those that people left behind, that people forgot. So, some people just weren't even wanting to investigate or even look into these children's deaths. And so it just went unchecked. And unfortunately, that happens a lot with a lot of missing children cases, that they get ignored, as more so if they are homeless or abandoned children or orphans. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources put into it to look for what happened to these children's deaths. It's tragic. It's horrible. And there should be more done about this particular thing. But that's a whole nother topic to begin with. But this is also Colombia, right? And Colombia doesn't have, like, this really good reputation. Because Colombia was already plagued with violence, drug cartels, guerrilla warfare, high crime rates. So many children missing was tragically common. But when the bodies started piling up in the same gruesome manner, police realized they had a serial killer on their hands. This is when they realized, okay, there's something up with this. This is not your usual drug cartel violence, guerrilla warfare, or any of this other thing. We got a serial killer, and we need to stop him. The investigation gained traction in 1997 when mass graves were discovered. Forensic experts noted similarities in the killings. The same type of rope use. The same brutal mutilations. But without a suspect, they were grasping at straws. They had no idea who this was. They couldn't figure it out. They were like, who did this? We got a serial killer, and he's targeting these children. Who's behind these crimes? And their workload is already piling up. Because they're police in Colombia. They have, like, tons of things to deal with, and they were overwhelmed. Their resources were overwhelmed, and they knew these particular children were all connected. For these particular cases, the 150 or 140, right? They knew that they were connected, but they could not figure out who the killer was, who was responsible for these deaths, who was the person that was committing these horrific crimes. And surprisingly, how they would get onto it, they would catch onto it is completely surprising. Because it's not what you would think. They didn't bring Garvito in for questioning for the killing of these children. So let me continue, right? Let me continue and tell you what happened. So Garvito's downfall came in 1999. So this is like 2 years after the investigation gained traction. In 1999, he was arrested not for murder, but for attempting to kidnap a young boy. While in custody, investigators noticed something suspicious. He fit the description of a suspect seen with multiple victims before they disappeared. So they were like, wait a minute. This Garvito, he mentioned the description of the person, the suspect that was seen with these children before they disappeared. And they're like, we think we got him. This might be the person behind these horrific crimes. He might be the serial killer that we've been looking for. And they were originally, arresting him for the attempted kidnapping of this other child. And that's how they got their big break. Okay, so a search of his belongings revealed notebooks filled with disturbing writings, fantasies, list of victims, even calculations of how long it took for each child to die. It was the smoking gun they needed. So he kept journals and diaries and explicit details and wrote down, like, how long it took to kill his victims. Like, he had figured out everything, how to do these murders, these deaths, by using mathematics to do these precise calculations, if you will. Like, he had it down to a science. He had taken the concept of serial killing and put it into a mathematical, scientific equation. That's how disturbing it is that he figured out a scientific equation, if you will, to break it down into. It's just disturbing, right? So, under interrogation, Garvito confessed. He admitted to the murders of at least 140 children, and possibly more. Because, like I said, they weren't sure how many children he killed, but he at least confessed to 140 children. The roundabouts, I think, is at least 200. And again, like I said, like 200 is by far a large number. Like 200 children, that's like 200 people. Like that, this is like getting to genocidal dictators like Mao Zedong and Adolf Hitler and, the Kim Jong family. It's those kind of numbers of deaths, right? So he's getting to dictator levels. Now, if you think a man like Garvito, a man who tortured and killed over 140 children, would be sentenced to death or life in prison. You would think that, right? But here's where the case takes a disturbing turn. Colombia does not have the death penalty. And at the time, their maximum sentence for murder was 30 years. Let that sink in. 30 years for killing over 100 children. Now, 30 years, that's it. Where in America, you would probably at least get a life sentence. But Colombia's like, yeah, they only had 30 years that they give someone for murder. And he killed, like, dictator levels of children. Like, he was slowly reaching the numbers of Mao and Kim Jong and Hitler and all these fascist leaders. He was reaching those numbers, and they're like, yeah, only 30 years. That was it. And the death penalty, I can see somebody not agreeing with it, because, they're like, well, the death penalty, why kill somebody for killing somebody, or something like that. I guess I could see the argument with that. But the thing is you think there would be a stricter sentence, especially since these are children. This sick bastard is, like, killed over 100 children, and possibly even more. And they're like, yeah, he's going to most likely only get 30 years. 30 years? 30 years! That's all he gets. 30 years? That's what I'd be saying if I was, like, in that area. Like, 30 years, that's all he gets. He killed innocent young boys, robbed them of the life they could have had, and he's only going to get 30 fucking years? And because Garvito cooperated with authorities and helped locate bodies, his sentence was reduced even further to 22 years, sorry. So his sentence was reduced to 22 years because he helped and cooperated with authorities, meaning he could walk free one day. And it's like, this is frustrating. It's like, I don't like this concept that it's like, oh, if you help us find your victims, we'll give you a reduced sentence. No, fuck that. Pardon my French, but fuck that shit. If you kill that many people, and you're just this genocidal, evil maniac, a serial killer level, you should not get a reduced sentence because you cooperated with authorities. I say, throw them in the jail cell and throw away the key at that point. I'm not one that supports the death penalty because I think that's the easy way out. I think you should have to sit in a jail cell for the rest of your natural-born life when you commit crimes like this. But definitely not a reduced sentence, like 30 years, and then it was reduced to 22 years. And it's like, are you kidding me? And public outrage was immediate. And you can understand why. Listening to this, you yourself are probably like, 30 years, Kai? That's all he was going to get was 30 years? And then they reduced it to 22 years? Oh my God. And so, yeah, the public outrage was immediate. People demanded justice. And yet, due to the legal system, there was nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, they could do. I guess there was something the public could do, but that's vigilante justice. I mean, the public could just fucking shoot the sick son of a bitch right in his goddamn head. Pardon my language again. So where's Garvita now? All right, that's the question you're asking now. You're like, please tell me he's locked up still in a jail cell. Well, as of recent reports, he remains incarcerated. You're like, oh, thank God. Yeah. But for years, there was fear that he could be released on parole for good behavior. Yeah, released on parole for good behavior. So his sentence was like, at one point, reduced from 30 to 22 years because he cooperated with authorities. And then they're like, yeah, this chance he'll get out for good behavior. He killed over hundreds of children. And it's like, yeah, he could get out for good behavior. No, there's no good behavior getting out. Keep him in the jail cell. He'll do it again. That's what these kind of people do. They'll do it again. So this case exposed major flaws in Colombia's justice system and forced lawmakers to reconsider sentencing laws for serial killers. But for the families of his victims, no sentence would ever be enough. For the over 100 victims, that would never be enough. But it's a good thing that they actually took a look into their justice system and said, you know what, it's flawed. And I get why their sentences weren't that long. They weren't trying to be like a country where people get like long sentences for ridiculous crimes. Though you would say for murder it should be a little bit longer, but I get it. They don't want to have majority of their people in prison like the United States. They don't want to be a prison system country. And I get that. But they realized there was a flaw in the system, and they're like, you know what? We need to fix this. We need to fix it to where people like Luis Garvito are punished. But at the same time, still remain our justice system to where it's not as violent as other people's justice system. So I get that. But like 30 years. And then 22 years. Wow. So Luis Garvito is a reminder that evil doesn't always come in form of a monster lurking in the dark. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it walks among us. And sometimes it only gets 30 years and then reduced sentence to 22 years. Sorry. But anyways, thank you for joining me on this episode of Threads of Evil. If you found this story disturbing, make sure to subscribe and follow for more deep dives into the world of serial killers and true crime. Because there's more. And I mean, I'm pretty sure it's going to get more disturbing as we continue. Next time, we'll explore the chilling case of Adria Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov. Until then, stay safe. And remember, the threads of evil can be anywhere. I've been your host, Kai. This has been Threads of Evil.